So I'd just like to welcome you all to the State Library of Queensland today. We're having a shipping and immigration and shipping session on what is available online. And as you will have seen, we have the Queensland State Archives, National Archives of Australia and the State Library all collaborating to present this session. So today I'd just like to introduce our speakers. Firstly, we have Saadia Thomson-Dwyer over there from Queensland State Archives. She's a senior archivist in the Public Access Unit. She has 28 years experience in the industry. She supervises the QSA volunteer indexing program and has done for many years. So QSA hold a wealth of valuable indexes which help researchers use their collections in a very meaningful way. Our second speaker will be Cara Downs from the National Archives. Cara's down the front here. Cara Downs has worked for the National Archives of Australia in the areas of public access for over 10 years, initially starting her career at the Archives Canberra office as a graduate. Another aspect of Cara's work is the provision of copyright advice and permissions for Commonwealth records held in the Archives collection. Cara has a strong archival background and has also worked overseas for the Oxford University Archives. Our third speaker today is Stephanie Ryan from the State Library of Queensland. She's been a research librarian here in family history at the State Library for over 22 years. She's participated in radio and television programs and has been interviewed for newspaper and magazine articles for her specialist knowledge. She contributes to the State Library of Queensland blogs and writes articles on family history. So Stephanie's part of the State Library of Queensland family history team, and they also conduct, as well as this presentation, other presentations. So we have some more coming up in September. We also present for societies, libraries and the general public. We have lots of information guides that are all available on the web, and there's also a curated collection of useful websites for family historians. So have a look at the State Library pages when you've got time. So I would like to now hand over to Saadia and we'll get the day going. Okay.
Thanks, Margaret. Just bear with me, I'm not tall and I have a very bright light in my eyes. Thank you for coming, everybody, and welcome along to our talk this morning. As you'll see from today, the three different organisations that are here, we have very different records, very different perspectives and different finding aids and the way we assist our clients as well. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of today on the different types of collections that we hold and how our staff can assist you and what sort of fabulous research you can undertake. To bear with me with the gadgets. So for those of you, hands up, who here knows what State Archives is all about? Sort of, most of you, some of you. Okay, just a quick refresher in case you weren't sure. Queensland State Archives operates under the Public Records Act of 2002, and prior to that, Libraries and Archives Act 1949. We are the custodian of Queensland's largest and most significant documentary heritage collection and the primary source records that were created by the government. They document our social, political and cultural history for all Queenslanders. Most records were created from 1859 in the colonial period. However, we do have a body of records that does go as early as 1824, although I have found an Admiralty map which is dated 1822. We have records that deal with lands, immigration and everything else in between that is of a government nature. We currently have, last count was 63 lineal kilometres of records. They're stored in our purpose-built repositories, which are state-of-the-art and beautiful. Very chilly, but that's good for the records. So that's what we call controlled conditions, where we regulate the temperature and the humidity and all those sorts of things. We have about roughly 5 million actual records, about 2 million pages of records. That doesn't include our AV collection and other artefacts that are held. And we basically only collect those records which have been deemed as permanent, that were created by Queensland State Government departments, agencies and authorities, statutory corporate those sorts of things within Queensland Government. So that's about 600 different agencies at last count. So you know what we do. So what we're looking at today is immigration, voyages to Queensland, and the different types of legislation and how that affects your research, because the legislation stipulates what sort of records had to be kept. The types of passage, because you could come out as a variety of passages, and some people came out more than once because they kept going home to motherland, and the different types of immigrants that arrived. And we'll also have a look at our immigration records and the different resources that we have available at state archives. So, and throughout this seminar, you see lovely little pictures from our collection. And this one was the first government-sponsored immigrant ship, the Artemisia, that arrived in 1848. So, basically, we hold immigration records for those people who came to Queensland ports as their first destination. So if you're looking for people that stopped at Sydney or Adelaide or Perth or Hobart or anywhere in between first, before they came to Queensland, so they overlanded or came by coastal punt, we won't have records because their immigration point of departure was that other colony. So we have the records for those people that arrived in Moreton Bay. They didn't stop anywhere else for a short sojourn. The records we have all came under government schemes, and there were quite a variety of schemes depending on the era. The majority of the records are actually for assisted immigrants. So if your people were full payers, nobody sponsored them, the government didn't assist them, they paid their own way, you have a much smaller chance of finding them within our collection, because basically the government didn't have to chase them for any money, so they weren't interested. That's the bottom line, the mighty dollar. But we'll talk a little bit more about that further on. As an idea of the impact of how many immigrants we've had since the 1840s onwards, we're looking at over 600,000 assisted immigrants who arrived purely between 1901 and 1940 alone. And of that 600,000, 471,000 plus were assisted. So for the 20th century, that's a huge number of records. What we don't have are those people who immigrated from the Americas, the Asias, or African countries, or even our mates across the ditch in New Zealand. We also do not hold departure records. Quite often people will come to us and say, I'm trying to look for evidence, great-granddad, we know he went back to England, have you got any records on his departure? Victoria was pretty much the only state that kept departure records. Queensland didn't, because again, the government wasn't interested in who was leaving, only interested in who was coming in. We don't have departures to other Australian colonies either in the 19th century. So what it's all about is the legislation. And it's the nitty-gritty that tells you what all the rules and regulations were, what people had to pay, who qualified, what records the immigration agents and the sub-agents had to collect. And it varied quite significantly over the decades, and the legislation changed over time according to the economics of the time, but also according to population requirements, because they sort of came to a period of time where they realised there were lots of blokes in the colony and not enough ladies. So what are you going to recruit? That's right, more women of marriageable age who can create little babies to build the population, that's right. So, for example, during 1861 to 1865, almost 53,000 people entered Queensland, compared to the following decade, where there were only just 15,000 people coming in. And that was due to a massive economic downturn. And if you're really into social history, look at what was happening in the wider world at those periods of time. So in the 1850s, you had this little thing happening up near Mr. Putin's territory called the Crimean War. So when you've got wars happening, all your menfolk are off to war. When they come back, what's the thing that tends to happen? That's right. Aside from the fact there's no TV and they had to do something with the time, and they got friendly again, they rebuild the farm, so they tend to stay put. Then if things aren't going too well, then they start looking at where are there other options for us to live, where there's a better economy. So you get these periods of war, not a lot of immigration. After war, immigration sort of goes up. So it's very much this sort of wave-like flow chart if you look at it. Then you have to look at much later, from 1881, immigration goes back up again, and this is where all these labour schemes come in. So your domestic labour scheme, your farm labour scheme, and your assisted immigration scheme, where you've got about 82,000 people arriving within a 5-year period. So it's very ebb and flow. The legislation outlines the eligibility, the categories of immigrants, what the immigrants actually had to do, so their commitments. So they actually had some burdens placed upon them. One of them was they weren't allowed to transport their feather beds. Yes, it is actually worded like that in the legislation, no feather beds. Employers who were sponsoring them had commitments about ensuring that they had work to go to and accommodation. And there were breaches and penalties, so you could be fined usually. In worst cases, more in the 20th century, you might be sent back home. There were scales for payments, depending on which category you were in, and the different types of forms that were used. So there weren't just immigration agents here in Queensland, there were also immigration agents in England and also on the continent. Every applicant for a free passage was required to pay the sum of £1 for every member of their family who counted as an adult. So anyone over the age of 14 usually counted as an adult. They had to pay it in 2 instalments, so it was an upfront instalment, and then after they got here, anywhere within the first 12 to 24 months, they had to pay back that second instalment. So this is why the government was more interested in documenting the assisted immigrants, because there was that financial transaction. They wanted to make sure they got their money's worth and their money. So it says here, the sum of £16 sterling per statute adult was the estimated cost of passage. The number of passengers had to be in proportion of a 2/3 capacity of the ship, because obviously they had to have cargo and all the ration supplies as well. And that is that 1/2 of that, in equal proportions of immigrants, had to come to Brisbane, and the rest could go to other ports in Queensland. So they couldn't sort of, hop ship wherever they felt like it, because they'd get tracked. But I'd like to see any records on that yet. We've never found any records on someone who didn't pay up and ran away. The legislation also gives us luggage limits. This is where we get the interesting things about feather beds. So in the 19th century, it was quite different to the 20th century, where we find people are packing their motorcycles and beach chairs. They weren't allowed to bring any bulky agricultural equipment, no furniture. If you think about feather beds, aside from the bulk, what do you think would have been the other issue? Bugs and quarantine, exactly. All those itchy, crawly mites. Yuck. And they probably had a few other issues on the boats as well. It wasn't allowed to exceed 20 cubic feet, which is actually a pretty large amount of stuff you can bring, especially if you've got 10 kids. Per adult, so you add that, you've got a family of 6, that's a lot of stuff you can bring. However, it couldn't exceed 1/2 tonne. So, bit of a conundrum there. Everything had to be divided up into boxes, and so they could pack everything. So nothing circular. You get much more packing space out of boxes. Now, the surgeon superintendent also travelled on the ship with the captain and usually your first mate and purser and all those other dudes. And you also had a matron who looked after the children and single women, but they obviously would have recruited mothers on the voyage to assist with the wrangling of said children. The surgeon was allowed a separate cabin. He was given 40 feet of space to hold his own luggage, because obviously he might need some medical stuff in there. And each passenger was assigned 16 feet of space, so it was very up close and personal, except for married couples who were actually allowed to have 18 feet between them in the deck in which they are berthed. So that was very much for, not tonight, dear, I've got a headache. There were limits on the clothing and requirements of the type of clothing that actually had to bring. So you can see by the list it's different for the blokes as it is for the ladies. I like the fact that ladies had to wear 2 strong gowns or have 2 strong gowns, so no evening gowns. And according to the Immigration Act of 1869, persons must bring their own clothing. They will be inspected and not allowed on board if the minimum quantities of supplies are not met. Obviously for laundry reasons, I would say. Other supplies. Now, whilst they weren't allowed to bring a feather bed, they still had to supply a bed for themselves. So, does anyone here know the joys of lace making? Nobody puts their hand up? Why I say that is because you make your lace beds out of straw. So, it's an interesting aside that immigration, often they used to make their pallets out of straw, and then after that, easily turf it over the side, mulch it down. But the ladies could use it to pack down to make their lace pillows. so that they could continue on with their handicrafts because that provided them with an income. So it was your bed could be very versatile for a variety of reasons. The supplies were required for the journey. So this is the list of the supplies that you can see here. Did that go forward? There we go. They had to be paid for and collected when joining the ship. If you were willing to pay almost double the amount that was required, you could have things like an extra pair of sheets, very exciting, a pillow, a counterpane, which is like a summer quilt, and a slop pail. Don't forget your slop pail. And your 3 pounds of marine soap. So the fares, these notices show that nominated immigrants, so this is 1891 and 1929, and I don't know if you can read them clearly, but you'll see that for males, in the nominated one to my right, your left, they paid, I think it says £3, and it depended on their ages too. So if they're under 12, it was 3. If they were up to 40, it was 5. Then you look 1929, which is a lot later, and you'll see it's significantly jumped in price. So depending on the economy, depended on how much people were charged. For many years, we didn't believe we had tickets. People used to ask us what were the tickets like that people bought in order to hop on a boat. And whilst doing some research for the banners that you'll see outside and the voyages to Queensland, I actually came across some immigration agent for Henry Jordan. He was immigration agent based in London. In his correspondence bundles, this actual contract ticket. So what it gives you, there are 3 sections. So the very first section on your left is the bit that the ship's captain kept, or the shipping line kept. The bit in the middle was your passage document that allowed you to get from A to B. This bit on the end, the little certificate, this is actually what a landlord certificate looked like. So it was valued to a certain amount, and then the instructions tell you what you were to do with it. So you take it, you go through the immigration department, then you go down to the Crown Commissioner of Land, you fork this over, they have a look at it and they say, where would you like to go? You can get £18 land order transfer. You might have half a dozen members in your family, they all have their own ticket, you can get quite a sizable block. And if you're really savvy and you go, well, we have people we know that live around Toowoomba, we know the land's good up there, we'll take some land up there. They'd write out a chit, they'd take off up to Toowoomba on the Cobb & Co coach, they'd go see the Crown Commissioner Land agent up there, and then they'd sign it off. We only have one record that translates a land order certificate like this into actual land. That's been indexed, and that's under the lands indexes on our website, and that is the only record we have that relates directly from a land order to actually owning land, and it gives you all what we call these days the RP data. So have a look at that. This ticket allows you to travel for a voyage anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on whether you're under full sail, a combination of steam and sail, or steam. Accommodation was first, second and third class, saloon, intermediate, cabin and steerage. Nobody wanted steerage. There were separate quarters for single males and single females and married immigrants. The ship's captain also recorded births and deaths, the odd but rare marriage, and what illnesses were aboard, mainly for quarantine purposes. Aside from the matron and the surgeon, if there are lots of children on board, they would often engage a schoolmaster as well. And the women and children, as I said earlier, came under the watchful eye of the matron. Surgeons and teachers, they were required under the Queensland legislation, and they had a duty of care to everyone on board. Single women were not to leave their quarters except to the permitted sections of the deck for daily exercise, and propriety was expected to control any misbehaviour at all times. The master will be instructed strictly to prevent the officers and the crew from entering any single women's cabins or married people's compartments of the ship. They were not allowed to fraternise. We also find lists within the legislation of the provisions that people were given, and it's all the different types of foodstuffs. So without dwelling on it for too long, they had lovely culinary delights such as corned beef, salted pork, York ham, ox tongues, breadstuffs, which were rice, milk, flour, pearl barley, vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, and anything that could be put in soup, and sundries like coffee, sugar, chocolate, jams, jellies, figs and spices. Each passenger was allowed up to, as part of their provisions, 24 bottles of port wine, 12 bottles of sherry, 3/4 gallon of gin. So you were probably smashed by the time you got to Moreton Bay. Because wait, there's more. 3 gallons of brandy, 25 dozens of imperial pints of stout. So they didn't drink a lot of water in those days or fruit juice. But only approved brands. Medicinal purposes. Wink, wink. Children, so infants, they had slightly different categories. They didn't get any of the alcohol. They got preserved milk, condensed eggs, or one fresh egg every alternate day if they could get them. Infants, biscuits, oatmeal, sago, flour, rice and sugar. They could supply water distilling equipment if required on board. Isn't it just painting a lovely picture of 19th century immigration? So the duties of the surgeon. So for example, we have here a report from the Surgeon Superintendent of the Storm King. So the bit that's in the box, he's talking about the sickness. So they used to get, the Romans used to call it barrack fever. You stick a lot of people in a tight space with not a lot of air and very good hygiene, you end up with horrible things like typhoid and scarlet fever and measles and lots of those highly communicable diseases. The surgeon would be responsible for appointing the matron and any constables who had to carry out watch. Some ships you'll find there's lots of correspondence about biffos between the crew and the passengers, between the crew on their own, between the passengers, fighting over rations because they've been becalmed, and the 6-week voyage actually took 3.5 months. So there's lots of correspondence that you can get through our index to ships, which is a card index available in the public search room. The sergeant also took reports of neglect or refusal, and he approved the payment of gratuities for any duties that may have been performed by passengers at his request. He was appointed with a base wage, and then he received a certain amount of, like a commission almost, upon his arrival per immigrant that was delivered. So that doesn't necessarily mean delivering babies, that means getting your immigrants to the port in good health. And if their health wasn't good or maintained, he might not get his bonuses. So this one on the Storm King, it was a trip from London to Brisbane, and the official report occurred during the passage of 88 days, having left Gravesend on October 21 in 1869 and arrived in Moreton Bay on the 17th of January 1870. So it took about 3 months. And he's talking about the illness and the accidents which occurred. There was a fracture of a hand to one fellow. Another one had a fall and retained a scalp wound. So they give you quite, and then he actually names the passengers. So if you do find a health report for the ship your people travelled on, have a good read. You might be a little bit more illuminating on the conditions of their voyage. We have a variety of health officers' reports aside from the written correspondence ones. By the late 1860s, they start doing these forms where they basically just have to fill in the blanks. So these are some examples from the Queen of the Colonies reports. So it arrived in 1865. There were 511 immigrants, 45 crew, and the ship was racked with typhoid and diarrhoea. One does give you the other. So that would not have been a very pleasant voyage. The schoolmaster was charged with looking after all children aged between 5 and 15, and they had to attend school. So they probably had lessons in the morning and then were free to run amok on the decks later in the afternoon. He had to keep a diary, and that had to be shown to the immigration agent when he arrived. And then that was delivered to the agent general once the ship was returned to London. So we don't have a lot of these records because of that being passed on through different custodies. If the schoolmaster neglected his office, the surgeon was charged to remove and replace him. So this is why you wanted to have some other educated people on board so they could teach the children, so they needed to be able to read and write. This letter mentions Emily and Louise Wally and Elizabeth Kemp, who deserve special mention for their attention to and progress in their studies, and to whom the teacher had awarded prizes. So anyway, and I also noticed there's John and William Eglinton, who are also recorded in there, and they deserved repeated mentioning for their good behaviour. So the types of immigrants. There were a few. There were bounty immigrants, that was in the very early system. The assisted passage immigrants, free passage, which means you didn't have to pay anything up front. Indentured passengers, so they're like your trade apprentices and other trades. Nominated or remittance passengers, which almost the same thing, and then you've got your full payer. So an immigrant, spelt a variety of ways, was any person who had obtained a free, assisted or nominated passage to the colony under the provisions of any of the Immigration Acts. And they came on a specifically nominated Queensland government immigration ship. The other thing is that the categories altered over the years as economic conditions changed in Queensland, which we said earlier. Now, outside, if you hadn't already collected it, you'll see Brief Guide 16 to immigration, and it actually gives you a full definition of each of those categories. So grab a copy of that and have a read. The bounty system, however, was slightly different. It involved the payment of set amounts of money, or bounties as they were called, per immigrant, to the people who arranged for and paid up front the passage for these people. So if you think of like the sheriff bounty system, like bounty hunters, it was a similar thing applied in an immigration sense. So that immigration agent who paid the bounties, or the shipping agents, it was in their best interest to ensure that if they had bountied 511 immigrants, they need to make sure there were 511 live bodies on that boat and 511 live bodies in good health that got off that boat, or they didn't get their money back. So it was quite an institution in its era. And it ensured that people were coming out here and were being looked after, because you often see in later health reports where the surgeons are complaining that the rations were contaminated, the food was contaminated, there wasn't enough of anything, the captains were neglecting their duties. So the bounty system was very good in that it kept people accountable. It was originally established in New South Wales in 1837 and was financed from the sale of Crown lands. So it was really instituted and used by the Queensland Cotton Company, the Queensland Immigration Society in the main, and you also hear of immigration agents such as Huesler, Brown and Frank. There are quite a number of them. They used this system very much during the 1860s and 70s. And it was also used to arrange for the passage of certain categories later on of immigrants, such as your female domestic servants, shepherds, mechanics and agricultural labourers, because they were work areas where we really needed the bodies. We'll just skip through some of these very quickly because they're just examples. This is an example of an immigration manifest. It goes through Townsville and stops at the different ports. And you can see it's actually broken up into the different types of passengers. So we've got your remittance and your free and your full payers. Pretty much all passenger lists give you a little bit of detail about the name of the ship, where it left from, where it arrived, the name of the captain, the tonnage, the names of the surgeon and the matron. And then at the very end, a passenger list might be 1 page, it might be 10 pages. At the very end, there's always a summary, so you know exactly how many bodies there were. They might give you a breakdown of which countries they came from, as in, Wales, Ireland, England, Scotland. Sometimes they even give you the counties, which is really handy. With the free passages, they were granted to particular categories of immigrants and their families, and were from time to time required. They wanted to actually encourage entire families to come out as opposed to single people. The categories, again, like everything else, altered over the years. As we said earlier, when they realised the population was very high in Queensland for males, they needed to recruit females to balance it out. At some points in time, they recruited just married couples that didn't have any children. So it was a very fluid thing. Applicants were required to pay the sum of £1 and a similar amount for each member of the family in this period of time. So I think this one for the Quetta is in the 1880s, before it grounded. And then the rules that applied by this time was that to be eligible, they had to be unable to pay any amount of their own passage. They could not have resided previously in any Australian colony, and they must intend to reside permanently in Queensland. So the rules change. This one's an example of assisted passages, and it's pretty much the same sort of thing. Again, you'll find this is by, what's the date on that? I think it's about 1900 by this stage. We have changed to recruiting families that include farmers, farm labourers, vine dressers, labourers and mechanics, again, unable to pay their full passage, and the same thing, haven't resided in any other Australian colony and want to live in Queensland. A full payer, those paying the full amount of passage money, for whom the full amount could also have been paid by someone else. So you can be a full payer who's also technically a remittance passenger because someone else paid your way. And you find this is increasing in this period of time. as the next slide shows us. So a remittance passenger, or a nominated one, was someone who was a natural born or naturalised, we're all British in that era of time, and they were residing in Queensland. They desired to provide a passage to the colony for a friend or a relative from Europe. They could obtain a passage warrant from the government on the payment of the required amount. The warrant was then forwarded to the friend or relative in their country of origin. On the presentation of that warrant, so it's almost like that ticket we saw earlier, the government representative in Europe would then arrange for a passage of that immigrant. So that's how the nominated or remittance passengers system worked. And often in these records too, you get the name of the nominator as well as the nominee. You might get addresses for where the nominator lived, or at least a locality. So you're getting a little bit more information about who brought them out here. This is just some other examples of the documents you will find that relate to nominated and remittance type passengers. So we have some receipts, we also have deposits, and these cards. These items are all from indexes you will find online in our immigration suite of indexes, which covers now, I think, about 500,000 entries. We've got approximately 1.2 million entries online now, with about 82 indexes, and more coming. Watch this space. Indentured passages, again, different sets of records. This was for a fellow called John Rennie. Now, an employer who wanted to secure the service of a particular trade, so they're very big on mechanics, servants and labourers. You get that right across the entire immigration time frame, would pay the money or arrange it as we said earlier. The employer in Queensland could authorise a representative in the Queensland government on their behalf, but by the sort of later periods, they're having to do that less and less. This particular one we have here is for the assistant immigration agent in Bowen. And you get to see all those names. So we won't go too much on the bounty scheme, but the land order scheme is the one that people are more interested in, because a lot of people always think if it's land order, it relates to land. It's a big furphy and it's a giant carrot. It was just a way to get people to come. If you come, we will give you land. But they didn't always have to take up the land. What they could do was they could convert that land order voucher into money. They still had the time frame in which they had to pay it back, but it might allow them, especially if you weren't a farmer, or you knew you were a farmer and you weren't a very good farmer, you might decide to set up your own laundry business. It gave you cash to hand to help set yourself up. So I won't read it out, but they're the idea of how it worked. The conditions for land orders, much like the other immigration schemes, change continually throughout the legislation and the time frame. The value of the land orders changed. It could be £10, it could be £18, it could be £30. The amount of acreage that went with that value also changed. The areas in Queensland that were opened up for land order settlement changed regularly, depending on the population. And also sometimes they'd open up an area of land and you couldn't fatten a lizard on it. People would come back and go, give me another land order, that's hopeless. You get people walking off the land and they go, okay, we won't send many more people out the back of Warwick because it's not really very good for dairy cattle. We might send them somewhere else. And so the Immigration Department had to work quite closely with the Crown Commissioner of Lands. What they had to do, there were even more requirements placed on the immigrant if they were in a land order system. Before the end of 5 years, every applicant must prove to the satisfaction of the Land Commissioner that they had not alienated any part of the land, so it's like subdivided it, chopped it off for anybody else, that they had resided upon the land for 3 years continuously, they had cultivated 1/10 of the land, or if they didn't cultivate that 1/10, they had fenced in the whole land with a good and substantial fence. You also had to have a dwelling as well. Then after that period of time, you've sort of worked off your nominal rent that you'd paid and your land order amount, it would convert to freehold. So you could end up, if you know where to look, you know your person came out in a land order, you found the passenger record that proves that the first time you find them in as a male over the age of 25, owning the land, in the electoral rolls, that's quite possibly the land that they got in their land order, unless they moved around a lot. How to search our immigration records. We have the brief guide, which I mentioned earlier, which is outside for you. We also have a search procedure that you can use in our public search room. It's called Search Procedure number 16 on immigration. We have a Pathways guidebook on immigration, which you can use in the public search room. And if we have any old spare copies, they're free. You just ask for them. We have a list of all ships that arrived into Queensland available in the public search room. It's called IMM 111. It has also been digitised, so you can now look at that from the safety and comfort of your own living room through our catalogue. We have quite a large number of indexes available online for immigration. A few of those have digital records attached. Quite a few of them we have now digitised the records, and we are adding those links to the indexes, but it might take another 6 months before those go up online, as we still experience some technical issues with our online indexing. Yes, we know, we're still working on it. But keep an eye out for sometime in the next 6 months. We are looking at putting up some new indexes, one which will be the index to ships 1848 to 1955, index to immigrants and crew 1909 to 1938, and registers of immigrants for the Rockhampton Depot 1884 to 1915. And they will have, at least one of those will have the digital images attached to it, so you can get your records for free. The index to ships was originally an old card index which was held in the search room, so basically we've been converting that to an online index, and where there are digital images and links, they'll be attached to it. It includes passenger lists, health officers' reports and correspondence, treasury payments for land orders, which then lead to another suite of records which we are currently indexing, and we're about 85% through. The index to ships in its old form looks something like this. So it gives you a brief description of what the record is in the old reference. So long as you have that old reference, whenever you come in, see one of the reference archivists and we can assist you to find the actual record as it's converted into the new numbers. 20th century migration, different again from 19th century migration. There are 3 main series that deal with it. These haven't been digitised as yet. And we are still item listing series 4227. We have about another 650 boxes to go. It's one of those 20-year projects. But as each box gets done, that gets loaded onto the catalogue. So that's what we say, check, check and check again, because you never know what's being added to the catalogue. So the first series, 4227, contains correspondence with the nominator, a report from the local police officer here in Queensland, medical examinations and immigrants' interviews. The other 2 series give you more information about their booking advices and passages, so definitely have a look at those. And we are almost finished. That's what some of the records look like. Nice pretty pictures, lots of family detail, and then the migrant aircraft colours look like this, and this is where you'll see they give the if they went on railway trips to and from Sydney and that. The other ones we have quickly, just so you can see what they look like. The correspondence for disembarkation, where you get some details. And this is, so we said you weren't allowed to bring feather beds. In the migrant ship and aircraft files, you get to find that they bring their motorbikes, their travel bags, their trunks, their toolboxes and their mattresses. And then, of course, we have Yungaba, which is where a lot of them went to before the Waco came into being. So that's pretty much my talk. I have gone a little bit over time, I do apologise. So I hope you've all learnt a bit about that, and it encourages you to come out to State Archives, have a look, hit those indexes online, constantly look at our catalogue, and if you've got any questions we might save them to the end, and I'll just hand it over now. Thank you everyone. How do I turn that off? There we go.
Okay, so good morning everyone. Today I'm going to be giving you an overview of the main types of records held in the National Archives collection relating to passenger arrivals and how you can find and access them. You will have been given a 1-page cheat sheet from me. This can be used as a guide to help you remember what I've spoken about today, because it can be a little bit confusing, but I'll do my best to make it straightforward. Okay, so on screen here you will see a list of the main types of immigration records held in the National Archives collection. The National Archives is responsible for the storage and public access of records created by the Australian Commonwealth Government. Only records of permanent value are kept, and this includes records of immigration, and immigration records make up a very large proportion of our collection. According to the law, the public have a right to access our records in the collection once they're over 20 years old. Okay, so this is what our immigration records look like. Today, most people use our internet to look at our collection. Most of the records are listed on our online database record search, and many have been digitised and can be viewed online, and this is what they look like. For those records that are not yet digitised, you can choose to pay for them to be digitised and upload to our website, or you can go into one of our reading rooms and view them for free. And many of our passenger records have been digitised, and I'll be showing you those throughout the talk. Okay, so after Israel, Australia has the highest proportion of foreign-born people in its population, around 1 in 4. Passenger records, such as passenger arrival lists and passenger cards, can provide evidence of a person's arrival in Australia, and therefore they're a valuable source of information for family historians and researchers. Our shipping records start in the 19th century but go right through to the 20th century, to the point where we have aircraft passenger arrivals for migrants entering the country. Most of our passenger records are arranged by the date of arrival, the name of the ship and the port of arrival, so unless you know these details, your search can be quite time consuming. Today I'll be focusing on passenger arrivals for Queensland ports. However, our Canberra office does hold passenger records for all Australian ports from 1924. Okay, so this is the homepage of the National Archives of Australia, www.naa.gov.au. I'm going to take you to the record search database so you can see how you can conduct a search for passenger lists using our website. So I've just circled them in red so you can see what I'm looking at. So you can see the top of the website, there's a collection tab. You just click on that and then there'll be a line there that says search the collection. Click on that and that will take you to our record search database. Sorry, the next thing you have to do is click on record search, which I've highlighted in red there. And once you've clicked on that, this is what the database looks like. And you will see one of the tabs along the top there is called passenger arrivals. That's what I'm going to start off with today. So we'll have a look at this first. Okay, so this is the passenger arrivals index. It covers the period 1898 to 1972 for ships arriving into Australia, and it also includes aircraft from the 1940s. You will see there, just on the side there, it says dates going up to 1966. Just ignore that because we have increased the dates, so they are now available to the early 1970s, and we will be continuing to add to that. The passenger arrivals index was originally based on our passenger lists for ships going into the port of Fremantle. However, it now includes other ports as well. Most passenger voyages coming from Europe made Fremantle their first port of call, and then they went around up the east coast. The Fremantle lists include names for people, regardless of whether they got off in Fremantle. They will include the names for other ports in Australia where they disembarked. So they are a really rich resource for family historians. If you were looking for Chinese migrants arriving into Queensland, the ships generally came from Hong Kong directly into Brisbane or other Queensland ports. They didn't go through Fremantle. Okay, so I'm now going to show you how to conduct a search on our passenger arrival index. I've just entered a person's surname, but if you have the information, you can enter the ship's name and the year of arrival or the port of arrival. Having said that, it's better to start off with a broader search and just enter a surname, because the more information you put in, the less results you're going to get back. So start off with a surname. Unless you have a really common surname and you're going to get hundreds and hundreds of hits, then perhaps enter a year of arrival or a ship. Not all passenger index entries include the given names or the ports of embarkation or disembarkation, so perhaps don't include a given name initially because they're not all indexed to include the names. And if your initial search is very specific, like I just said, you're going to have less chance of finding what you need. Also, if your search is unsuccessful, remember to try different spellings, alternate spellings of names. Anyway, so let's see how I go with the search for the surname Frau. Okay. So I know that the family I'm looking for includes the father Andrea Frau and his wife Paula and his daughter Maria. You'll see that Andrea arrived in August 1949 into Brisbane on the ship the Napoli, and his wife and daughter came out about 18 months later. They're listed down the bottom, December 1950 on the Sorrento. After World War II, men were needed in North Queensland to cut the sugarcane crops. The government allowed hundreds of Italian men to come out on a short-term basis, and often their wives and children followed later on, and eventually they were allowed to remain in Australia on a permanent basis. If you don't know approximately when a person arrived in the country or which port they arrived at, it can be difficult to ascertain which person is yours, particularly if you say have 10 Andrea Fraus come up. And this is where you need to use other immigration records to try and narrow down the person, using dates of birth and other details. You can see on the right the digital copies, so all the shipping passenger lists on this index have been digitised. So I'm going to open up the one for Andrea Frau now so you can see what that looks like. So this is the screen you'll be taken to when you click on that View Digital Copy button. So his passenger list is an 8-page passenger list. You can see there I found him on page 5 of 8. I'll zoom in now so you can actually see his name. So I've just highlighted that in red there. So it just gives his name, I think his age, departed Naples and arrived in Brisbane. Okay, so we'll go back to this page now. So there's his daughter Marie and his wife Paula. I'll click on their digital record now. They arrived 18 months later, and we'll see if we can see their name. So this one, when I opened this one up, it's only a 1-page file, and their names are not on it. Unfortunately, I can't really explain why this is, as there could be multiple reasons, but I think it's a good example in how you need to really be a detective to find a person's name on a passenger list. Because we can't see their names on this passenger list, I'm going to show you how to look elsewhere. So today I'll be showing you that we can find this family's name on at least 3 to 5 different sources. So don't give up when you go to that and you think, why is their name not there? Because unusual things like this happen. So this is another good example. I recently had a client in our reading room who came in and wanted to find his own passenger arrival record, so he knew the date of arrival, obviously, the name of the ship, and I thought, okay, this is going to be an easy one. So we looked up his name on the passenger index. I put in his name, the ship's name, the date, and nothing came up. And after some detective work and looking at other records, I realised that the ship that he arrived in, the family name, the surname, was actually not indexed for some reason. So entering a surname was not going to help us at all, which was very frustrating because, of course, that is what you were going to put into the index. This just highlights the difficulty in searching for passenger records. Even when you have the information that you want and you think it's going to be straightforward, you really need to try all search possibilities, including different spellings of names, and then looking elsewhere, really, because this was almost impossible to find given there was no surnames. But we did find it eventually by being detectives and using all the records. So just remember that if you have an unsuccessful search. Okay, so we've looked, that was the passenger arrivals index. That's our only index at the National Archives for passenger arrival records. Next, I'm going to talk to you about Series J715. So the National Archives office in Brisbane holds inwards and outwards passenger lists for all Queensland ports, with those for Brisbane dating from as early as 1852. The Brisbane passenger arrivals have recently been digitised and are now available for viewing online. They used to all be on microfilm, but now they're all on our website. They cover a large date range from 1852 to 1964 and include ships coming from overseas ports and also some coastal voyages. These passenger lists are arranged by the date of arrival and the port of arrival. So unless you know this information, your search may be quite time consuming. Having said that, there is a name index for the time period 1852 to 1899 that was created by the Queensland Family History Society. You can access that here at the State Library and also on Find My Past, but that's only for that time period. And there is also an index of the names of all the ships, which was compiled by Charlie Nolan and is available with us and at the State Library. So if you don't know the date of arrival but you do know the ship's name, you can go and look up that information so you can then get the date from that index. And when I was searching for Andrea Frau, again, using the J715, I did have to consult Charlie's list because I just wanted to be sure that this ship arrived on this date. You'll see that these are very, very long lists, so I really wanted to know the date before I went trawling through hundreds and hundreds of pages. So I'll show you how to search for these in a moment. I just wanted to show you these because they're pretty. The earliest passenger list we have for Brisbane, Moreton Bay is 1852, and this is what the earlier lists look like. The one on the right is the Humboldt-Meyer, which arrived in Brisbane on the 8th of November 1870 with over 300 Prussian migrants on board. Okay, so now getting on to how to search in Series J715. So what you need to do is go to our record search database and go to the advanced search screen. When searching the lists, you really need to know the approximate date someone arrived. So you need to enter the series number, J715, in the series search field. And then in that date range, I've put in 1949 because I want to show you trying to search for that Andrea Frau record again. Okay, so when I clicked on search there, it's brought up this one record. It's got a date range of 1st of November 1948 to 30th of April 1950. So this should include the ship that he arrived on, which was August 1949. And that view digital copy button that I've circled there in red, you just click on that. And as I just said before, you can see that's a very large record. So this one has 1,485 pages. This is why you want to know approximate dates because you'll be scrolling through. There is a jump to page facility at the bottom there, so I just sort of put in around, I was guessing, around 800 pages. I found the list for the Napoli on page 685, and I'll just zoom out so you can see that now. I think it was only a one-pager, yes. And this is another interesting one. For some reason, the passenger list is only one page and only records one person, and Andrea Frau is not listed. Even though it is definitely the correct ship and the correct date. It says the Napoli, it says 23rd of August 1949 into Brisbane. So it can be quite frustrating. When searching through J715 passenger lists, if you can't find what you're looking for, I would also suggest that you search a few months either side, as sometimes the pages can be filed out of order. So, for example, I decided to scroll through a few months and I did find the Napoli, the same ship, further on in this digital record. However, there was no date listed on that list, so I couldn't be sure. And to make matters worse, it did have a proper passenger list, but for some reason, letter F was not there. So I was like, great. So I think this is a really good example that you need to look in several places when searching for passenger arrivals, and doing just one search in one resource, in one source, is not necessarily going to give you the result. It can be very frustrating if you find a record like this one. However, as I just said, there are multiple places that we can search, and we did actually find Andrea Frau on the passenger arrival index at the beginning, so we were successful there, but not here. I just put that picture there just to make this slide look not so boring. Okay, so I also did a search for the arrival in J715 of his wife Paolo and daughter Maria, and unlike Andrea's arrival record, my search for them was successful. And yeah, so they're just there highlighted in red. That was on page 693 of their file. So they're all about that same size, they're quite large. And I am glad that I found this because if you remember at the beginning of the talk, I did not find their name on that list using the passenger index. It was kind of a reversal for both of them, really. So yeah, I'm glad that I found that there. Okay, so far we've looked at the passenger arrivals index and the J715 Brisbane inwards list, which have now been digitised. Another place where you can find passenger arrivals is in our Brisbane Series J25. Series J25 consists of our main Queensland immigration case files created by the Department of Immigration from post-World War II, so it's from 1946. Most files in this series are about a particular migrant, but there are also ships' passenger lists. Dating from post-World War II up to 1976, and from then it becomes aircraft arrivals. So you can see here I've done a search for the ship Napoli. This is how you search for J25. You need to enter J25 in the series number, and in the keywords field you need to put the name of the ship, Napoli, and make sure you include the keyword nominal. Otherwise, if you don't, you'll get a lot of individual case files on people. We just only want the shipping lists. So when I do that search, I got 5 results, which is good. These 4 there relate to the Napoli arriving in Brisbane between 1949 and 1952. And so that's the one that Andrea Frau will be on, that top one there for August 1949. They've all been digitised. Not all the J25 passenger lists are digitised, but most are. We are working on that proactively, so many of them are. The J25 passenger lists are quite good because often they will just contain that extra information, such as letters and just more details about the voyage. On the left side here you can see, and it says Andrea Frau, it's got his visa was issued at Naples on the 13th of July, so just before his voyage. And on the right, up the top, it says his address where he will be going with S. Frau, probably the person who sponsored him, and going to live at Ingham. I also did a J25 search for the Sorrento to see if I could find the ship for his wife and daughter, and they were there as well. That's their file for the Sorrento, and they're listed at the top there together. Okay, so quite often we need to use other immigration records in the collection to help us in narrowing down our dates of arrival or other useful information that will then assist us in actually locating a passenger list. If you don't know when a person arrived in Australia or the name of the ship, you can do a search for other immigration records using our record search database. So I've done a general search I put in the name Andrea Frau, and 4 records came up in our Brisbane office. Luckily they were all digitised, so I can show you some of these now. So these pages here come from the family's main immigration case file, which is in Series J25. That's the series we were just looking at with the passenger lists. Their file is 114 pages, so it's quite a large file and includes a lot of information and also some beautiful photographs. And these 2 pages are also taken from that same J25 immigration file on them. I just wanted to show you these pages because they really highlight the fact that if you have no idea when someone arrived in Australia, if you can get their immigration record, you can often find those details. So I've highlighted in red. On the left there, it tells us the date the Napoli arrived and into Brisbane, so it's giving us his arrival details. And the same for Paolo, it's got the Sorrento 1950 into Fremantle. So this is where I actually started my search off for this talk, was I went to the immigration records first, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to go and find the passenger lists, and then did get a bit frustrated when they were these passenger lists that were coming up with no names on it and things like that. But I am glad in a way because it does highlight the difficulty in searching the passenger lists and how you need to go about it. So the next one, this is the front of Andrea Frau's alien registration card, which again provides us with details of his arrival in Australia. So I think all those 4 immigration records that I found on the database all provide us with his arrival details. This is the back of that card. This is where they had to report on their employment and change of address or employment to the Department of Immigration. So this provides invaluable resource for family historians. So BP 9/3, that series, contains personal statements and declarations of aliens entering the state of Queensland. These details were collected by the Customs officer, and you can see here on this record it also includes his arrival details, the name of the ship and the date. So you'd be pretty happy, I think, if this was your family and you found all of these records. Next one's a BP 25/1. These contain alien registration papers completed by the Department of Immigration for aliens entering Queensland. And again on this, it's got the Napoli written at the top, so it's got his arrival details on this one as well. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of the 4 files that I found on that family. So by searching for the Frau family, I hope I've given you an example of how you can find a passenger arrival record for a person who arrived into Brisbane. You have seen that we've got passenger records for people coming from all over Europe. We also hold records of arrivals from Asia and the UK. For British migrants, you might not find as many records as they were not required to register as an alien, and for a time period they did not need to become citizens as well. And I will show you some British passenger arrival records next. So as I said before, the J25 series are quite good because they do contain extra information about a voyage. This is a great file on the voyage of the Multan, which departed Tilbury in April 1949. And as you can see on the right, this passenger list also includes the passenger's occupation, which is quite good. The Multan was a Royal Mail ship that was built in 1923. It served in the Second World War, and afterwards it was predominantly used to carry 10-pound POMs to Australia under the Assisted Passage Scheme. So this is one of those voyages. In April 1949, the Multan arrived at Tilbury the day after a passenger, 69-year-old Richard Allen, had died. The cause was smallpox. For the next 3 days, the Multan was quarantined before any of the passengers or crew could disembark, and in this time, 5 more passengers died. This is a letter that was on this file as well, so I really like seeing, you don't get this that often, but I'll read this one out to you so you don't have to worry about trying to read it. Dear sir, I wonder if you could help me regarding my brother James Nelson. He was a passenger on the Multan leaving England on the 28th of April. I had no word from him since except a card from England, but I've heard from neighbours that had friends on the same boat that he had gone through a serious operation on board ship and it meant life or death. Now, would you please tell me if this is true or not, and if so, the nature of his operation? I'm very worried about him as I'm his only sister and I don't know how I could get in touch with him. I did write to England, but they advised me to write to you. Please answer this and let me know at your earliest, as the suspense is terrible. Do not notify him, as he would be very annoyed if he thought I was worrying. Please answer soon and oblige, Mrs. John Oliver. And this is the reply from the Commonwealth Migration Officer. Refer to your letter regarding the health of your brother James Neeson, who was a passenger on the Multan. As far as I'm aware, your brother disembarked at Brisbane in perfect health on the 23rd of June 1949. Mr Neeson proceeded to employment at Ipswich, Queensland, and they're just telling her where correspondence can be forwarded to him. Okay, BP 23/1 includes 116 passenger lists for British migrants arriving into Brisbane from 1946 to 1951, so it's not a great date range. This is the nominal roll for the arrival of the Ormonde into Brisbane in 1948. We do know from press reports that the Thomas family shown here were the largest family on the ship. I think there's about 7 children there. And it's got their occupations, which is quite good. Okay, BP 26/1, that series are passenger arrival cards for Queensland ports, same date range again, 1946 to 51. These were all created by the Department of Immigration. All these records are listed on the database at item level, so all you would have to do is do a search for that person's name and these records will come up. So they are all on the database. You can do a name search and you will find them. You don't have to remember the series numbers or anything like that for these. Okay, so we've looked at arrivals from Europe and the UK. If you're trying to find arrivals from China, it is a good idea to search our collection of CEDTs, which are certificates exempting from the dictation test. Chinese people needed to have a CEDT if they were travelling in and out of Australia, so it allowed them to get back into the country when they returned home. Not only that, but they provide photographs and they're just very beautiful records. Okay, so the National Archives, as I said earlier, also holds aircraft passenger arrivals. In Brisbane, the main series is J922, and this starts at 1934. There are about 700 aircraft lists in this series, and at the moment there's about almost 200 that are digitised, so they're not all digitised. I've just entered the series there, that's how you would do a search, and I'm searching for 1968 aircraft arrivals. So I got 27 results there for aircraft arriving and departing in 1968. You can see that some are digitised and some are not on the right there. If it's not digitised, you can order online to have that digitised or just come into our Brisbane office and view the original record in the reading room. And this is what they look like. So they're fairly large files again. This one is 280 pages. The information contained within these files is not extensive and it often will only include just a surname like that, but we do use these regularly for people who need proof of arrival into Australia. Okay, so to conclude my segment, I will briefly take you through our Destination Australia website. The aim of Destination Australia is for people to be able to share their migration story. So Destination Australia includes thousands of photographs of people arriving in Australia, taking English classes at work and at play, celebrating festivals and religious ceremonies. You can search these photographs by keyword, or there is many categories that you can also search under. So I've just searched under the category of migrant arrivals and transport ships. So that's just one of the categories that you can go into. And there is thousands of photographs. If you see yourself or know someone in a photograph, you can tag them as well and add information. So it is all about sharing information, which is really great. And the other main part of the Destination Australia site, so it's photographs and stories are the two main parts. You can check out the stories and photographs other people have added to this website. These personal, family or community stories, they're all arranged in themes. I've just done a search under the theme of the journey. And they show the rich and varied experiences of migrants who came to Australia post-World War II. This is the Brisbane National Archives office. We're located at Cannon Hill. We're open Wednesday, Thursday and Friday from 9 till 4:30. Now, if you're searching for passenger arrival lists and you need some help, you can't find what you're looking for, you can go to the collection tab, which I showed you earlier, and then click on Ask Us a Question. Here we have different categories, so you can click on immigration records or passenger arrival records, enter all the information as much as possible of what you're trying to look for. We aim to respond to inquiries within 30 business days. And that's it. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We really are in a different category from everybody else because we do a lot of the problem solving. And so we use everything we can get. I want you to become, at the end of this, a little bit more aware of our state library resources and to look at some strategies for flexible and successful searching. I think that Cara has made it really clear that we're struggling often with a number of problems to find those records, and I think Saadia has indicated pretty clearly that things changed a great deal over time. So what we would like to show you is how the SLQ resources and services relate to those repositories. Okay, State Library has got a family history focus because our records are collected for the family historian, but there are a lot of records that simply because of their nature benefit the family historian. This is the state collection and it's a very, very significant one. These are the sorts of holdings we've got. Firstly, all Australian indexes, not just Queensland ones. And we've also got the lists for the 19th and early 20th century. I think you will have realised from what Saadia and Cara have said that it's a pretty messy patchwork. We've also got databases, but only because of the conditions that are laid down are they on site. And those particular databases are Ancestry Library, that is the library edition, not just the individual owner database, and Find My Past. And they provide access to many overseas lists as well as Australian ones. We've also got lots of newspaper accounts, including Trove. The State Library is the major collector of the Queensland newspapers, and through Trove we have access to a huge range from all the ports over Australia. There are books and diaries. John Oxley collects most of those, and a number of them have been digitised and are actually available on site if you use our catalogue. And of course, images of ships. Saadia showed you the Artemisia, the first one to come directly to Moreton Bay, and a photograph we all use probably ad nauseum because it was such a big event. And the Moreton Bay Courier got particularly overexcited about it, as did the Illustrated London News, but there are many, many more. We collect not just government records, and government records is what state archives and national archives collect. We also collect non-government records, newspapers, books, personal collections, diaries and photographs. And a lot more of that is now being emphasised with the John Oxley collection. But how do you find all this? I mean, where do you bring it all together, for goodness sake? And we do have a family history page, and that website is in your notes. And there you will find guides. We've got dozens. Indexes on the web, we've got a few, but we'd like to add many, many more. And we've got our useful websites, and we have links within those websites to where you mainly want to go. And on that page, we have links to Ancestry and Find My Past. So we have resources that are electronic, microform and printed. And what do I use? The lot. These are some excerpts from our family history page. You get to it from the main page by going to Resources and then Family History, as you can see on the left, then to e-resources. That's where you will link to our useful websites and where you will also find our e-resources. As I said, that's in your notes. And we do need the wide scope of records, as many of you will understand, because we're mainly an immigrant people and we're on the move. So you need the wide geographical scope that goes beyond Queensland and beyond Australia. And again, I know I'm emphasising it, but non-government records are very important for personal information. Finding the arrivals, which is where we come in, quite a bit. It's really, really important, and I think that this is really emphasised by Cara. You have to cross-check, and it's quite a long process. In fact, many people tell us 10 or 20 years. And oh, how my heart lifts with the excitement when I get that letter that starts off, I have been searching for 10 years. And I think you expect me to find it in an hour? Okay. So it's not easy and not always possible, but we do work the occasional miracle. And of course it comes out, in a 2 or 3 line thing like, found them on this list. And, yet it can be quite a search. Chain migration, people say, they'd have come together. Well, no, often someone came first and then others eventually followed once they were sure they could set the family up. And just to repeat what Cara said, those who paid may be listed with initials only. Not a first name, no personal name. How do we know that John Smith is your John Smith, especially when their ages were just a lucky dip or fitted exactly the description that was required for immigrants at the time? Another issue, and we're going to look at this, family members on board in different classes were often not listed together. And especially when they spell their names differently, that is not just from what their real name was, but it's different from one to the other. That can be pretty thrilling too. So you need to check shipping lists from other Australian colonies or states. We became states in 1901. Individuals may be recorded with names other than their familiar ones, and only for the most honourable of reasons. But the point is that there are many errors, as we keep saying. Names can be heard incorrectly. Mr. Maloney said, we only ever spelt it this way. Don't use those wildcards. Well, use the wildcards. I can tell you there are at least 4 variations on Maloney. They can be spelt variously and they can be transcribed incorrectly. Now, the person writing it down is not necessarily the person whose name it is. And of course, names change quite a bit. And you all tell me about it, don't worry. The place of arrival is different from that of destination. Immigrants may travel by coastal vessel or other means. And they came together, yes, not necessarily on the same ship. But they planned it together and they came fairly close together. Just to reiterate our general search strategy, and Cara certainly emphasised it, no more information than is strictly necessary. Keep it simple. Use truncation and wildcards. Truncation is when you cut a word right back to its stem and you use whatever that wildcard is. It's usually an asterisk, maybe a percentage sign. Different variables in changing combinations can sometimes help. Use the least common first name before searching for a family's arrival. Research back from yourself. If you've got a name like I've got, Ryan, and everybody who ever came from Tipperary only ever has the same first names. When my great-grandparents came out, there were 3 Dennis Ryans, 3 Mary Ryans. Now, only one of each was mine, and the whole place teemed with them. If I hadn't have gone carefully back, well, we won't go there. Okay, so when and where did they arrive? How many times we asked it? The death certificate gives you the time and place of arrival. The trouble is that people filling out the death certificates didn't always know. So it was approximately 30 or 35. Fives and zeros can be suspect. Identify the last documented event in the country of origin, the first documented event in Australia. And those can be births, marriages, censuses, naturalisations. Obituaries, diaries, letters, other government records, and you can find those in the government archives from whom we've been listening, from whom we've heard, the parliamentary votes and proceedings, police gazettes and hospital records. And of course we have the votes and proceedings and police gazettes here. One of the main places to search for people coming to Moreton Bay or Queensland is in New South Wales. We were part of New South Wales till 59. When the Artemisia came to Moreton Bay, they were coming to northern New South Wales, as they were until 1859. People, even after that, moved very freely between the two colonies or states, and it's forgotten or unknown that the family came elsewhere. The ship arriving in Victoria or New South Wales will be recorded on that state's list, even if they moved up to Queensland. But on the death certificate, it'll just say Queensland. So this is where you have to be on the hunt. To reiterate, assisted passengers in New South Wales, extensive information for those years. Unassisted passengers, and these are not on the New South Wales State Archives site, but they are, they're there in bits and pieces. You need ancestry for that. And once again, how do you find it? Go to useful websites, New South Wales, online indexes, immigration and shipping. And there is Ancestry Library, and you'll soon find your way there. We've also got the lists on microform and on the net. I've used both. You need to. Assisted migrants got financial help at some level. I'm not going to into any detail on that. I think that both of the previous speakers have covered it very well. Same with unassisted, little detail. I've got the old page from the State Records of New South because it points out what they have up to 59. So Moreton Bay, 48 to 59, Sydney and Newcastle to that period, and the other areas they cover, even in Port Phillip, which later became Victoria. Okay. So, when and where did the Moonies arrive? Well, firstly, Mooney is a common name. Patrick Mooney is also a common name. But there are certain advantages if you work your way back, and I can't emphasise that enough. You don't just say Patrick Mooney arrived somewhere in the 19th or 20th century, but he died in 1851 as an elderly man of 51. So the outer date is 51. When his widow, Margaret Mooney, died, this was after 1856, so you now get civil or government records of death. And that tells us that she was 39 years in Queensland. Now, we love that 39 rather than 40, because that gives us a more precise idea, and in fact, they arrived in 1850. We also are looking for certain people with Patrick Mooney, his wife Margaret and his daughters Anastasia and Ellen. But we can see that down at the bottom there were other children who had died by the time Margaret did. If we do a search of the Queensland deaths, and we can do it without a surname, but if we put the parents' names in, Margaret O'Brien and Patrick Mooney, we bring up James and Mary. So we know we're looking for James, Mary, Anastasia, Ellen, Margaret and Patrick. So if we go to their records, we put in the surname and we put Anastasia, obviously is a nightmare, so cut it back, truncate it. use the wild card, which in this case is the percentage sign, go 1849 to 1851, and there you have Anastasia on the Cornwall in 1850, and the reals listed that denote their arrival. So then we then get rid of Anastasia's name from the search field. We put in the ship that we've now found, the Cornwall, the year 1850, and there are all the family members. And there, of course, is Patrick. He's shed 11 years. Because they didn't want people who were not able to work, and 40 was the upper age. Just remember, there'll be anything required to get that free passage. And so we've already heard about the from Saadia about the immigration agent list and the department lists. The immigration department collected a lot of information because they were paying. And of course, naturally, it's the least readable. Now, the Irish are our major nightmare in searching for records, so it is a great blessing to find the parents of Patrick Mooney indicated, Rodger and Anastasia, both dead. Note the question mark next to his age, entirely justified. Margaret's parents are William and Joanna, and Brian, spelt quite differently, and her father was still living in Ulla in Limerick. So that's very useful information. But hang on, they're on a Sydney list, and they came to Moreton Bay, and we know they were only in Moreton Bay. How come they would come to a derelict convict settlement with no family? This is going to be an interesting thing we're trying to find. There is the immigration agents list, less information, but much clearer, so it's worth checking. Now, these you can see on film or you can see them on Ancestry. They are from the state records. So here we have in mind, well, what are they doing here? And the Sydney Morning Herald explained that. When people got free passages and they came in and there were too many people in one place, or other areas really needed the migrants, they'd simply be moved around. So in this case, 26 came to Moreton Bay. Now, in 1850, 300 were sent up from Sydney to northern New South Wales. So they came up probably with a little bit of encouragement. Land was on offer and he bought 30 acres. So they came into Sydney, not to Moreton Bay, and the death certificate gives you no idea they went to Sydney, but they moved on pretty quickly with a little bit of encouragement from the government. They came to a derelict place. We're looking at people coming to Queensland or Moreton Bay, but we don't always find them on the Queensland lists, especially the unassisted. So here we get Minnie Curd, a most unfortunate name, I would have to say. Was it Gerd? Well, okay, if Minnie's your relation, do follow her up at State Archives. So there she is on a Victorian list coming to Brisbane. So, okay, then we find Minnie, and I'm told now that she's Gerd, not Curd. But isn't it wonderful that she was asked for as Curd and we found her? And we find her on that wonderful series J715, Coming into Brisbane. Now, just to reiterate about that J715, it's on the net, it's digitised. Queensland Family History has done an index, but who wants to go through the 1,795 pages on many reels, because they don't indicate what pages those ships are on. So we have a very hard-working, very frustrated volunteer trying to put the pages for each list. Okay, Wordsworth. This query came to us from Victoria, and this woman said, all of my research is in Victoria, but this woman married so quickly after she arrived that she must have come straight to Queensland. Well, not quite. Her name was Carolyn Wordsworth. She was 39. She came with her sons Charles and William. We can find her on the Victorian lists inwards, and again, someone's mentioned this, that they also record the outwards lists in Victoria. So they're not staying there. We can find them coming in and going out. We were able to locate the time because she was a widow, and over on at the top left you can see that her husband, Charles Favell IV Wordsworth, abbreviated to Charles FF, died in 74. And even though he was a Queen's Counsel, etc., these wealthy, high-placed people didn't ever save for their widows and children. So it was often instant poverty. He was 67, but he had a young family and wife. So there are Caroline, William and Charles on the Victorian list going to Sydney. But we couldn't find them on the Sydney list. Why not? When we look for Wordsworth, variant spelling. One of the good things about Ancestry is you can search by the name of the ship and the date of arrival, and then you can search. Or alternatively, you get out the film. I do both. And there we can find them. Caroline Wordsworth is recorded as Carolyn Wadsworth. Now, her son Charles is in a different category. Caroline's in third cabin. He's in steerage. And he is recorded as Ward, W-A-R-D, Wordsworth. Now, when the second letter is wrong, it's often a problem. But they weren't even consistent on that one list. But, of course, you know to go in and look because of the Victorian list. Now, we're still a bit bamboozled because, we're looking at the right people. The names measure up, but the obituary tells us that she arrived in Townsville in 1879. In fact, she arrived in 1880. She arrived into Sydney in June. She'd married by the beginning of September. This is what's called pretty hard work. So there she is, married in Queensland, and had, at the age of 40, 3 more children. And they said she's a pretty hardy woman, and the evidence is yes. But can you see, they're coming to Queensland, but we're finding them and tracking them elsewhere. If I'd tried to find them on the New South Wales list first, I probably wouldn't have. But I knew to look from the Victorian list. And I knew, as with a lot of obituaries, they get some information right, but some of it's not right. So here we have James Rodger Wilkes. This is one that had done the rounds, as in I've been looking for 10 years and am frustrated. And the story was that he'd come especially to Queensland to build some equipment. Okay, we knew that that he'd had a baby, and when we looked up free BMD, we saw that baby was born in December 1885, or in the December quarter. Now, there's a pretty big, it's more than likely that he was hanging around then in 1885. They were having children in Queensland in 1888, but he's not on the list. Again, we're picking him up in Victoria, using the advanced search, putting the dates 1885 to 1888, and not even using his second name, James, which is Rodger, James Rodger, just James Wilkes. And here we find him on the Lusitania. He arrived in April, and we can see, because it's the Victorian list, that he's going out. But this is the beauty of the Victorian fuzzy searching, which is also a nightmare, by the way, that even though we've put in James, it's picking up James Rodger and J. Rodger Wilkes. And here is where we get to the cruel truth of the lists. Many of them aren't beautiful. In fact, are almost impossible to read. If you can see that, you'll see that James Rodger Wilkes was a riveter going to Sydney. This is the Victorian list. So what happened to his wife? Well, again, the least common name of the children was Maud, and when we put in Maud, we find that they came in on the Aberdeen in 1886. Get rid of her name, just put in the surname, the ship and the year, and there they all are. The children, that is, and the wife. And they're the reals to look at. The higher numbered one gives you the greater detail and naturally is close to unreadable, and the lower one is clearer but lacks the detail. And there they are. And when you look at that list, they are all wives joining their families. So she came from Staffordshire, and the question is, relations in the colony? Well, she had a husband, another one had a brother. So they were joining their families. It was quite an interesting list to look at. This relates to an artist, and the standard comment was about whom little is known. And somebody who was restoring his work was desperate to find it out. But he knew that he went to Dunwich. He contacted Queensland State Archives because Dunwich was a government facility, and found out that he came to Brisbane in 1870 on the ship Maryborough. Now, this is kind of like an extraordinary breakthrough because he's been written about quite a lot, and you'll see his artwork on the Trove National Archives. That's a little bit of an indication that you can get a lot of information elsewhere other than on shipping records. And here he is on the wonderful J715. I don't think I've actually emphasised how incredibly grateful we are for them putting that up. So we couldn't find him. The name index is on 2 CD-ROMs to 1899 and on Find My Past. But we've also got an SLQ volunteer indexing the date range. So we can find out his ship from that index, but then we can find the pages of the Maryborough. Now, that hasn't been made publicly available yet, and our volunteer is suffering a lot trying to work out the Chinese names and the order of the records, but eventually we hope that with a lot of our other material it will go up. Now, that's the list for Australia, but if we look at the Liverpool, England crew lists, we see a little bit more clearly Charles Gordon Hurst. He was an assistant baker and discharged at Brisbane. And this is his agreement and account. And we find out that his previous ship was the Barham, which is interesting because he writes a lot about being in India, and that's where it was. This was a little mystery that came to us over about 4 inquiries, and a few of the staff who've worked on it are here. The Frings of Brisk Island. I was trying to find John Frings's grandson, and then I see this little boy and I think that might be him, but then I know that that isn't his wife. His wife is down south, but here we have a Mrs. Frings with a little boy. And who is this Florence Isabel Frings? Look up the electoral rolls on Ancestry. And we have a Florence Isabel Frings of Brisk Island, who is a literary assistant. John Frings is a writer at this stage. Now, we've all seen those sidebars that are automatic hinting, and most of you would know always be highly suspicious of them, because in an era of traditional naming patterns, there'll be lots of people with the same name. But when you're the sole occupant of an island, you're the lessee, you know everyone there is connected to you. So we see that Florence Isabel Frings was actually Florence Isabel Meek, not on any of the Australian birth records. Okay, and these are the records we can see. So Florence Isabel Meek was obviously Florence Isabel Frings at the same place as a literary assistant in all cases. If we look at the State Archives Index, 1922 to 1940, we can see that Florence Meek arrived on the 22nd of April 1924 on the Diogenes. But if we look at the British records, we get a bit more information. We find that she's a clerk, that she's 27, and that she comes from Thames Ditton in Surrey, which is an interesting little bit of accumulation of information for when she returns, because we saw her with Charles Chauvel and her husband in 1935, but in 1936, the sole lessee of Brisk Island, John Frings, dies. So she returns to England. And there we see them on the index, Mrs. F.I. Frings and Master J.A. Frings. And she is returning to Thames Ditton, Surrey. So we've been able to find her coming and going and her rather intriguing presence on Brisk Island while his wife is down south. But we won't go into that. But what happens to this woman? See, this is it. These men die and they're basically stranded. And this is where the fabulous 1939 register comes in, which is a census substitute. And we find that she is at Southend-on-Sea. So we look at the records and we unlock the household and go through all that drama they love. And we see that she's actually living with another family. And when we then go in, we discover that she is doing paid domestic duties. She's become a servant, but intriguingly, she's just dropped 5 years. She was born on the 30th of September 1896, but she's kept the day and the month, but just dropped 5 years. Her son must be in boarding school because he's simply not listed. Even if he were listed, it would have a black bar that it was officially closed because he wouldn't have been 100 when these were released. So then when we compare the GRO online, which is the General Register Office in England, we can see, and I know that that must be very difficult to see, that she was born in the December quarter of 1896. When she died, she died and her age is recorded as having been the 30th of September 1896. So we know we've got the right person. The shipping records allowed us to put her story together, and it also indicated to us that we can get a bit more information from records of those leaving England as well as those arriving. I just want to go through a few errors here. And this is to do with an Ida Wheeler. One of our amazing, truly astonishing staff did this. And it was a request from England to find Ida Wheeler. Now, this ship sunk, and so it became very important that the list was right. But inaccurate names were given. Ida Johns, Miss W. Johns, Miss C. Johns. It was corrected, and then it became Miss C. Wheeler. And then it was corrected again. This is now May that the third record comes out. Miss Ida Wheeler and servant C. Johns. But it was the initial list that was printed in the London Times, which led to the query. So always be wary of what's printed. Mrs. Lance Rawson, we found on a list from looking at newspaper accounts of when the ship left and the date of arrival and her name. When we then tracked back through the index, we found she's recorded as Mrs. Louse Caowan. Don't rely on the indexes. George Alfred Carthew Wright. Could we find George Wright? Came in the end of the 19th century, maybe early 20th? No. But the person who was searching for this, after a year, discovered he could look at the hospital records at Croydon, found out that he said that he arrived in the Cara, misspelled, and when they looked at the two of the records, he found that it was around about 1893 or 4. It took a minute. find my past, travel and migration, and then nothing more than a surname. Don't worry about George. 1893 plus or minus 2 years. The ship Cara. Just those little bits and bingo. There's GAC Wright. Now, he'd have to get off at Thursday Island. We've got those records. Why can't we find it? There he is. Normanton, GAC Wright, George Alfred Carthew. And, of course, naturally, 2 people got off at Thursday Island, one of whom was Mrs. G.S. Wright. So we had no way of finding him because it was incorrectly recorded. And fortunately, there were only 2 people who got off. Another one, the Skyrings, early settlers in Brisbane, first land purchasers. What happened here is they were indexed with the Wolf. The Wolf was a whaler. And it actually says on the list there were no passengers. They actually were indexed with the ship following rather than the ship earlier. And thank goodness the shipping intelligence was right. The Duns, they were there as Dumel. Now, this is a comparison of what you'll get on a state records index and ancestry. Now, if they got those townlands right, it was valuable information because that's how you're going to find these impossible Irish. And when you look at the list, in fact, it wasn't this Glowhetty at all. It was Coolnamunna, Glanahilty, and the child didn't even have a townland because it was just born on board the ship. Missing German ships. Some wonderful things called ancestry. A long-suffering volunteer is indexing those, and those 2 ships of the early 1850s, Solon and Diana, are there. I'm not going to go through all of those records because you've got them in your notes, but this is the substitute for finding the shipping lists. 2 pages of them here. Immigrants from Hamburg. Again, could we find an Adeline Mask? Looked by her first name. She was there as Marshka. But of course, they're just going to make it sound Australian. Elizabeth Schultz-Botcher came on the Morialty. As you can see, just above her photograph. In fact, they said the British consul. The ship changed its name. And we can check that on the report in the paper and also in Lloyd's Register, where it tells us it changed its name. So you've got the issue of German spelling, different form of the first name, and change of ship name. And do we ever have it? People have a way of, when they record this in their Bibles and letters, and every other way of making it sound more familiar. The La Rochelle became the La Rochelle, the La Rochelle, the La Rochelle. The Lusitania became the Louisitania. The Caddo Wattel became the Caddo-Waddle. And Raja Gopal became the Roger de Paul. I assume a relation of Vincent. We've got some wonderful ways of tracking some of these through the Ship's Picture Index from the Australian National Maritime Museum. They've taken theirs down. We've added our own records of books. Lloyd's Register, and of course the fabulous trove none of us have raved about, but very important. Take a look at our guides, shipping lists and more than lists, which were on the table. Charlie's list, where he's tried to bring together as much as possible, given I'm just noting that Saadia was saying they're going to put more up, but it brings together the records of state archives, national archives and the State Library. It was a feat over years and we're still waiting for it to go on the net. It's organised alphabetically by the ship's name and by the ship's date of arrival. Find out about the ships in Trove, the Index and Lloyd's Register. We have a wonderful book on the ships of the 1880s when Queensland had a contract with the BISN line, which gives you pictures and a wonderful summary, and lots on the 1860s as well, when the Queensland government had a contract with the infamous Black Ball line. Shipboard diaries, a lot of them online. And what never ceases to amaze me reading them, a lot of the stuff that goes on is pretty standard, but they act as tourists in their own countries. They go to visit, Kew and see what all the plants and things are. Or in the case of this Frederick James merchant, he went, and I still bamboozles me, from Liverpool, a major shipping port, to Glasgow to get the train. And he went to the art galleries there. And that's what is fascinating. But you can see the sorts of things they record. The journeys varied in their route, especially in the 1880s. They came through Suez and down the coast. And as Saadia said, they will be recorded as they come down the coast in the different categories of assistance or otherwise. But, of course, there are other fabulous journeys where they went around Victoria or Tasmania. A story for another day. Newspapers, including Trove, have all those wonderful notices. You know them, they're in your notes. Reports can be fascinating. Because we were paying, or Australians or Queenslanders were paying, people loved to tell you what they thought of the passengers. In this case, and this is from something that was, 150 years later, they got the name of the ship wrong, should be the Great Pacific, and it tells you the single men are an undersized, boyish-looking lot, while the generality of the married men are a vigorous set. Several of them have a clean and vigorous appearance. Taking them as a whole, they're an inferior shipment, and during the passage took all that lay in the power of the surgeon, superintendent, and captain to keep them in order. Now, for whatever reason, the people in Rocky, who are the relations of those, are desperate for copies of it. There are no prizes for being good in family history. Obviously, the indexes to multiple resources, ancestry and Find My Past, huge advantages, but major drawbacks. Inaccurate links, automatic hinting can be a problem, indexing can be poor, and records can be missing. Wide variety of records, and you can get free access for 3 hours a day. Those who disappear may have died, moved elsewhere, had a change of name, a broken marriage, ended up in an asylum, and that could be for any number of reasons other than mental illness or even in prison. And that's pretty good if they do, because often there are good records. Our useful websites are a good way of connecting, and there should be sheets outside. I've just put 3 of the examples: National Archives, State Records of New South, and Queensland State Archives. Note that we've got links to the key points you need to go to. So when you sort of say, my God, she's given us an awful lot of information, at least have a look at that family history page. So identify the window of arrival. Somewhere in the 19th or 20th century doesn't help. Be aware of the different information. I know it's disappointing when they just say J. Smith and no age. Search beyond the place of arrival. Beware of variant spelling, names and ships, and broaden your awareness of records other than shipping lists. Cross-check, so important, and I think that was really spelled out by the previous speaker. We've got a lot of non-government records as well as government records. You need the resources, guides and skills of all the repositories. I think that's also pretty clear. And State Library provides key information for all Queenslanders on-site and remotely. Don't forget about our Ask Us service. I'm trying to skip over the 2-hour free research because that's now 1 hour. And I've obviously forgot to alter that. Use the online catalogue to get not just lists of books, but lots of things which have been digitised. And use your free membership. And I've probably gone over, even though I tried to scoot. And it would be nice if you... Yes. If you've got some questions, certainly not just for me, but for the other speakers. Are there any questions?
Just interested in Seamen's registries.
as you can see, we found some for Charles Gordon Hurst, but also Saadia can answer that one. Their records start later. Do you want to have a go at that one, Saadia? Yep.
We have an index to seamen and deserters that goes up to about 1919 on our website. The downside is that most of them only give their initials, and even though there's like about 10 columns worth of information that could be completed, they tended not to complete most of them. So they may have an age, they may have, they usually have the name of the ship they've been discharged from or deserted from, but the other details are not necessarily there. And that's all we have. If you go through the index to ships, we have very few crew records, but National Archives, they do have marine transport records with Merchant Marine, where you may be able to pick up some detail that way.
Deserters are in the government gazettes, which we hold and which also State Archives holds.
Would there be any records of those that might have jumped ship?
Yep, if they can track them down, they will be in the police gazettes. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm interested in the Chinese immigrants, and someone mentioned from Hong Kong directly to Brisbane. Oh, sorry. I'm interested in the Chinese migration. The first date I've got is 1867 in Rockhampton, a marriage, and I'm just wondering if you can give me any clues where I can look or anything more on a Chinese immigration.
There is a problem with Chinese migration for that period because they were often just a number in steerage. Later on you find the names, and the best records end up coming through National Archives. But your question is one of many, and they change names so often because of the way they're recorded. Are there any other questions?
I've got a question for National Archives. Wondering if there are any specific lists for arrivals of Jewish people pre-1915.
I can't answer your question, just off the top of my head, but there could be. I'm not sure. We've just recently done a talk on Jewish migration. That was actually our last monthly seminar. So I can find out for you and get back to you on that one.
We've got another question. Then after that, we might like to just wrap up, and the speakers will be here for a couple of minutes if you wish to speak to them.
There was one slide on the aircraft manifest, and what would be helpful is just to understand a bit more. Is there much more actually on aircraft documents like landing cards and stuff actually being held at all, or is it just that's almost it, just that aircraft manifest?
We do have, the aircraft passenger manifest, and we also have aircraft arrival cards, so kind of like the cards. I'm not sure if we still fill them out these days. So we do have them going through to the 1970s and even the 80s, aircraft passenger cards. Yes.
And our migrant ship and aircraft files are only the passenger list, so don't give you any of those other records.
Look, I'm always amazed when we do these talks how much more there is to learn, and I'd like to thank everyone for their questions and the speakers for enlightening us.